Glenn Most, Shame and Rationality in Plato's Gorgias.
Thank you very much, Don. Thank you all for coming to my talk in the way in which one does in the era of Zoom. I have a couple of brief announcements before I begin about the talk. The first is that there is a handout which has been put onto the chat, and it will be helpful for reference to the texts that I will be mentioning in the course of my discussion. The talk that I'll be giving to you is fairly short and fairly swift, and I'm giving it to you in part because I'm considering whether I might not develop it into something more extensive, and on the basis of this discussion, I might decide not to do so. The original version of this talk has not yet been published, but it will be published in Italian in a Festschrift for a friend of mine who's a professor in Florence. And there's probably no better way of burying a text than to publish it in that form. It is co-written by myself and by an Italian professor of moral philosophy named Carla Bagnoli, who is a close friend of mine and who is also an admirer, as I am, of the Italian professor to whom the Festschrift is dedicated. So she and I worked this out together, and we wrote every sentence together. I am presenting it, however, in my own voice today. And if I do decide to expand it, it will be probably in conjunction with her. Finally, it's nice to see friends here. Thank you for coming. So, shame and rationality in Plato's Gorgias. What is the relationship between shame and rationality? Now, one might think that there is no close relationship between them whatsoever. After all, shame seems to belong to the domain of psychology and of morality, while rationality belongs to the domain of logic and of reason. Moreover, shame depends on norms that have been developed in particular social circumstances, while rationality has at least a universalist aspiration. And finally, shame is almost always connected to actions that are performed, whereas rationality does not need to be connected to such actions. But an ancient Greek text like Plato's Gorgias can show that shame and rationality can interact with one another in a systematic way. The force of the norms of rational discourse can be not only reinforced, but even established and stabilized by the use of techniques of conversation, which are employed in order to provoke, intensify, attenuate, and manipulate feelings of shame. How are we to understand a text like this one? One first exegetical possibility would be to suggest that Plato belongs to an early phase in the development of Western rationality, when shame was still a necessary instrument, even if a regrettable one, for helping reason to prevail, and that, fortunately, mankind has overcome this condition which is so defective. Alternatively, instead, it might be thought that Plato wanted to show that some of the characters in his dialogue are still philosophically immature, and that they have not yet reached the condition of maturity in which there is no longer any need for shame in order to be rational. Or else, third, one might maintain that this dialogue is addressed to readers who are inexperienced, that is, ones who have not yet learned enough about philosophy in order to be able to do without these social and dramatic accoutrements. But even those scholars who do not underestimate the function of shame in the Gorgias, by treating it as a mere symptom of the philosophical immaturity either of Plato's times or of his characters or of his readers, often tend to consider the social dimension of his dialogues like an element that is entirely superfluous, a literary means that serves to attain an end which is purely rational and which can be separated from them and appreciated entirely on its own. But are such interpretations plausible? Can rationality really do without shame? And is there not a sort of rationality inherent within shame itself? In this talk, I will propose in part a textual analysis of some parts of the Gorgias of Plato, in part a reflection on the relations between shame and rationality. What I hope to show is that the normative force of rationality depends, at least in part, upon an emotional element, shame, and that the rational exchange of reasons and of arguments is a discursive practice which is socially organized and socially sanctioned like other discursive practices are. The fundamental question that I'm asking is, from what sources do the norms of rationality itself derive their force? There's no doubt that Plato considered shame to be a key instrument for moral progress. This is interesting because for Plato, moral knowledge is a type of knowledge to which one arrives insofar as one is endowed with reason. Shame compensates for the lacks and the defects that can be present of rationality, which show themselves not only in errors of reasoning, but also as an indifference to the authority of reasoning and to rational argumentation. Shame can sensitize an agent with respect to the normative force of reasoning, insofar as it is a social emotion. Differently from other emotions, shame exposes us to the gaze of the other and renders us vulnerable to judgment and to criticism. This vulnerability to the other testifies also to a susceptibility and an availability to be corrected and to learn. To feel shame for having done something shameful is worse than not to do anything about which one should feel shame. But it's better than doing something shameful without feeling shame. Shame recognizes in this way the validity of the very same social norms that are violated by the shameful act. This is true both for pudor, in Greek eidos, that is, the type of shame which prevents us from performing shameful actions, and for verecundia, Greek eisphune, that is, the type of shame that one feels for having done something shameful. In English, both concepts are expressed by the same word, shame. By focusing on the social nature of shame, we can understand better not only that learning is organized and distributed socially, but also that it is often articulated in terms of social relations that are strongly asymmetrical. Shame can have the cognitive effect desired only if the agent perceives upon him or herself the judging gaze of someone whose judgment has a weight for him or her. But the gaze of the other can have a weight for very different reasons. Because it is the gaze of a friend who presses us and whom we esteem, or because he has a role and a position in society that are prominent, or again, because we attribute to him or her an epistemic authority or a superior morality. In the Gorgias, the double function, compensatory and corrective, of shame is the central architectonic element of the interaction between Socrates and his interlocutors. Shame is an integral part of the argumentative method of Socrates, which consists in forcing his adversaries to recognize an incoherence, manifesting the terms of a conflict of which they were not aware, and thereby demonstrating a conflict between their convictions and the implications of them. The very term elenchos, which is typically applied to the central procedures used by Socrates to interrogate his interlocutors with the aim of determining the degree of incoherence of their beliefs, has its origins in the practice of public shaming of someone for his bad behavior. If you look at text 1 on the handout, you will see that lexicons of ancient Greek separate unjustly into two distinct and different lemata, the single term elenchos, which is attested in lyric and epic poetry in the Archaic period with the meaning of someone or something which is worthy of blame, shameful, and another term, elenchos, which is attested in later Greek poetry, rhetoric, and philosophy with the meaning of an argument or mode of interrogation, typically used with this aim of refutation. But I think it's obvious that both of these two terms are only two aspects of the same process, which is denoted by a single term, and which is presented in our texts in a historical succession. To return to Socrates, the fundamental premise is that we ought to feel ashamed of being incoherent with ourselves, in our beliefs and in our intentions. As Gorgias says, and this is text 2 on the handout, at this point, Socrates, it would turn out to be really iskron, shameful, if I in particular would not be willing to. I, who have promised to be available for the questions of anyone who wants. Therefore, if it seems the right thing to all of them, you have a dialogue with me and ask me what you wish. The shame recognizes the transgression and the validity of a norm which imposes self-consistency upon an agent and a speaker. Coherence is a form of integrity, which is not only logical, but also moral. Now, shame is, as a social mechanism, potentially extremely explosive. To make someone publicly feel shame means to run the risk of provoking feelings of such hostility as to render impossible the continuation of any form of civil conversation, let alone a philosophical discussion. In general, people who are publicly exposed in their weaknesses feel themselves to be humiliated, and not always do they accept willingly the lesson that is given to them by recognizing the inadequacy of their own capacities. Instead, they often feel resentment and rancor, and they react with rage and fury. They feel, quite rightly, that they are being disrespected, as though they are being stamped with a mark of inferior status, inferior to what the other interlocutors enjoy. Their violent rage aims towards a compensation for the disrespect they have suffered, and it is designed to reestablish an order of equality which their public humiliation has damaged. All in all, to make your own interlocutors angry with you is probably not the most promising way to teach them. So, from the very beginning of the Gorgias, Plato shows us Socrates indeed humiliating his interlocutors and trying and succeeding in provoking shame in them. But at the same time, Plato's Socrates has the shrewdness to use a broad range of tactics and formulas of courtesy in order to weaken the impact of the shame, so as not to attract destructive reactions towards himself, and above all, to direct the motivational force of the shame into more constructive directions. With this intention, text 3a, he flatters Gorgias. Text 3b, he postpones to some indeterminate time in the future, for the sake of the present intense discussion among few intimate friends in which Socrates excels, the public presentation in which Gorgias is more at his ease. He professes, 3c, with false modesty, his own incapacity to understand the issues, and he offers, 3d, usefully, his own attempts to clarify the questions in such a way as to understand them better himself and the others together with him. It is particularly impressive in this part of the dialogue to note the recurrent invention of fictitious dialogues by Socrates in order to pose demands that are difficult in an indirect way, and one that is less embarrassing to his partners in the dialogue. That is to say, he invents hypothetical dialogues with an interposed person who doesn't exist. Thus, in 3e, he imagines fictitious questionings of his real interlocutor. In 3f, he imagines fictitious questionings of himself. In 3g, he imagines fictitious questions that are posed to his real interlocutor by himself. In 3h, fictitious questions posed by himself and by his real interlocutor to fictitious interlocutors. And finally, 3i, fictitious questions posed to his real interlocutor by himself and by fictitious interlocutors. It is remarkable how often in the beginning of their dialogue, Socrates invents dramatically fictitious dialogues as parallel to the real dialogue, the real fictitious dialogue that he is having in the fiction of the Gorgias. Such fictive questionings disarm the potential aggressiveness of the questions of Socrates. If his interlocutor might happen to feel offended and to protest, Socrates could always defend himself by claiming that the questions didn't come from him, even though obviously there were his questions, but from someone imaginary. So too, at the beginning of the dialogue, Socrates preferred that it not be he who conducted the questioning, but instead delegated Chaerephon to this task. That's text 4a. And a little bit after that, he had delegated to other people a complaint about his interlocutor, rather than making that complaint directly to that interlocutor himself. That's 4b. And above all, Socrates emphasizes repeatedly, with a formula of marked courtesy, that there is really nothing personal in his argumentative procedure, that what is at stake is not his person or the person of his interlocutor, but rather the truth, which has to be established by means of the argument itself, which constrains both of them to follow its own trajectory, whether they want to or not. These are the texts that I've indicated in 4c. Seen in this light, even Socrates' notorious irony, which claims to always know less than what there is good reason to suppose he really knows, may be understood as a strategy intended to reduce the destructive effect of shame, by suggesting that he too is ignorant just as much as his interlocutor is, and that if they want to learn something, they'll have to do it together. All these aspects of Socrates' politeness are put into stark relief in the Gorgias by the strong contrast that Plato draws with the impoliteness of Polus, who does not hesitate to brusquely interrupt other people, intervening directly into their conversation, texts 5a, and who manifests an unequivocal lack of respect for his interlocutor, text 5b. So, in this dialogue, shame is itself, no, sorry. What is interesting beyond this is that in this dialogue, shame is itself not only a motor of the conversation, but also a subject for the discussion, and that it is put on stage in various lights. The different perspectives emphasize its social character and the fact that it is an emotion which is regulated by public standards. But they represent different and contrasting evaluations on the public nature of such standards. Socrates begins the game, but his authority is challenged, contested, and refused. Each of the interlocutors claims for himself an authority based upon the arrogant presumption that he holds a special position. Gorges claims to be supremely eloquent on any specific argument, indeed, regardless of any argument at all. Polus claims to be in perfect harmony with ordinary opinion, so much so that he claims to not be different in any regard from the voice of the people. And Callicles claims to be absolutely immune to shame because of his unrestrained frankness. Socrates proceeds to undermine their respective claims by showing that in reality, they don't know what they're talking about. They do not know their own minds, either because they are vain, like Gorgias, or unreflective, like Polus, or ambiguous, like Callicles. What are the effects of this interaction? I'll start with Polus. Polus praises, this is text 6a1, the way of life of the tyrant Archelaus, because he can do whatever he wants. And Polus declares, 6a2, that injustice is bad only if it is discovered and punished. Polus, text 6a3, presents his point of view like a question of good sense, which does not have any need to be demonstrated. Socrates confronts Polus with his contradictions, but the effects of his realization of this are not evident. At the end, text 6b, Polus declares that he does not find Socrates' argumentation to be stringent, and he leaves the discussion, suggesting that Socrates' position leads to absurdities. This exit of Polus seems to demonstrate that even when moral truths are presented at the level of consciousness, they do not have a hold on Polus. That is to say, that shame does not have a normative subjective authority for him, at least for him. In the same way, Socrates forces Gorges to feel shame, text 7, but at the end, Gorges is not ready to fully accept the implications of Socrates' reasoning, and therefore he refuses the authority of reason. In the initial exchange with Gorgias, text 8, Socrates had established a distinction between persuasion and knowledge, and the corresponding difference between the aim of rhetoric, which is to produce persuasion, and the aim of education, which is to produce knowledge. If we take seriously the perplexities of Socrates' interlocutors, then we ought to reconsider the cognitive function of shame. One received interpretative hypothesis is that shame is a direct form of knowledge of what is shameful and of what is shameful and what merits shame. According to Charles Kahn, shame reflects a Platonic conception that corresponds to our notion of an innate moral sense. Shame operates in this dialogue like an obscure intuition of the good on the part of Socrates' interlocutors. That's Kahn. According to this interpretation, the emotional experience of shame precedes, from an epistemological point of view, the reflective judgment and opens the way for it. Shame becomes a mode of moral judgment of a type that is not discursive. Its value is instrumental, and it derives from the fact that it searches out the object of moral consciousness, even if it does not do so by means of concepts. Nonetheless, I do not find this interpretation to be entirely convincing. Shame makes conflicting beliefs emerge, and sometimes true beliefs emerge, but this does not demonstrate that shame, which is induced, is a mode of discerning the truth. Take a look at texts that I mentioned in 9. If this were the case, then the epistemic role of the agent would become secondary, and the acquisition of knowledge would be more similar to an imposition that comes from outside rather than to the subject's own exercise of reason. Perhaps a more plausible thesis is that shame does not serve to transmit directly moral virtues, moral truths, as those who propose the theories of moral sense sustain, but rather that it has the function of facilitating a kind of coming to consciousness of the moral truths by bringing to light and rendering effective a moral knowledge that is truthful, but unconscious and obscure, insofar as it has not yet been fully elaborated conceptually. According to this reason, to shame is attributed an important epistemic function because it is the affective and social mechanism by means of which the agent is obliged to recognize his or her own contradictions by submitting his or her own beliefs to the scrutiny of reason. But this does not mean that there is a direct acquisition of moral truths by means of shame, as would happen in a theory of moral sense. It is instead the emotional effect of shame upon the subject that permits the rational acquisition of the moral convictions, not because shame has a function that is directly cognitive, i.e., that is the source of discernment for itself, but because in order to have authority on agents whose rationality is imperfect, rational argumentation must mobilize this social emotion, reminding the epistemic agent that his or her defects are under the eyes of everyone, judged according to public norms and submitted to other people's criticism. This reading seems to fit better to other considerations that emerge on induced shame when Callicles enters the scene. Callicles maintains a radical form of hedonism, according to which pleasure functions as the only motive for action, and he considers a life to be useful if it is completely dedicated to the search for pleasure, without any respect for conventional restraints. Look at text 10a. Callicles speaks with frankness, and he thinks that this character trait is praiseworthy and renders him immune from shame, text 10b. Callicles is skeptical with regard to the power of shame to reveal the truth because of the conventional origin of shame. The sense of shame is based upon education and thus is conventional. In order for shame to be a reliable indicator of the truth, it is necessary to distinguish between what is really shameful, aiskron, and what is shameful according to conventions. Indeed, Socrates himself is sometimes accused by his adversaries of behaving in a shameful way. Take a look at the two texts that I've given you in 10e, but of course there's many others in the Platonic corpus. But we ourselves, as readers of Plato, have no difficulty in recognizing that what is at stake here is shame understood in a conventional sense, at least for some people, not that which is truly shameful. If shame is imposed by convention, then it cannot function as a reliable guide for moral truths, because it could be the case that there could be a gap between the sincere judgment of what is shameful and the feeling of shame that is associated with it. It is natural, text 10d, that it is more shameful to undergo an injustice than to perform it. But by convention, it is the opposite. Callicles' distinction plays an important role also in the reflexive mode, because it is used by him to give an account of the dynamics between Socrates and the other speakers. For Callicles insinuates, text 10e, that Polus had felt shame at expressing his true moral convictions, and accepting the game of Socrates conducted in the terms of conventional shame. In effect, Callicles' distinction, shame by nature, shame by convention, indicates the social nature of shame, to which, for example, Williams has pointed. And it introduces a difficulty that might seem to lead to aporia, or to impasse. Socrates induces his adversary to feel shame when he is confronted with his incoherence by appealing to the universal character of the truth. But how can we know that the universal character depends on reason rather than upon convention? The answer to this question cannot be obtained if we stop at the phenomenology of shame. In this sense, the dialogue does not establish any truth, but it illustrates a transition which may be considered a progress. But whose progress? In fact, we have said that none of Socrates' interlocutors acquires a respect for the truth and the sense of justice, even though they all three feel shame. The transformation that Socrates is awaiting happens, if it happens at all, not in their minds, but in the mind of the reader of Plato's dialogue. For it is the virtual readers of Plato's dialogue who are the true spectators of Socrates' conversation. Both Socrates and Gorgias have need of a public, but they select their audience according to criteria that are very different. To understand the reason for this, we have to consider the relation between the feeling of shame and the fact of being touched by the gaze of the other, or rather make apparent the particular social nature of shame. As we saw earlier, many factors can influence, increase, or weaken the intensity of shame, which people can feel when they are exposed to public criticism. The identity of the witnesses is an important factor, but no less important is the mere number of the witnesses. Even though one can feel shame, even with the certainty that no one is actually looking at us, nonetheless, the intensity of this emotion increases notably with the number of the people to whom shame exposes us. It's already pretty bad to have to feel shame in front of a few intimate friends, but to have to feel shame in front of a large crowd is, for many people, intolerable. Socrates prefers dialogue, the intense discussion which is conducted within the limits of small circles of people who are very similar to one another with regard to the most relevant aspects. They are always males, they are almost always adults, they are well off economically, they are usually Athenians, they are shown in their moments of leisure. This contrasts strongly with Gorgias's marked preference for splendid exhibitions of oratory in front of large and heterogeneous crowds. Certainly, this tendency of Socrates is not only a concession to the empirical fact that philosophical complexities can be analyzed better in an intense discussion conducted in small groups, but I would suggest it is also an attempt to contain, to limit the dangerous potential of shame, which is the driving emotional force of these dialogues. Imagine how much rancor the interlocutors of Socrates would feel if they were humiliated, not in this way, not in front of a small group of friends, but in front of a large crowd. Those interlocutors of Socrates don't know that beyond the limited circle of the spectators present at their discussions with Socrates in Plato's dialogue, the ones that they themselves can see, there will be generations and generations of future readers of Plato's dialogues who are invisible to them, who will participate virtually, observing and analyzing those fictitious humiliations, and in this way preparing themselves to confront the dilemmas of real life. Thank you very, very much for your kind patience.
Thank you. I'll clap on behalf of the music group. Those of you who've done this colloquium before know that we operate using the raise your hands button. Those of you with questions or comments, please raise your hand. And I see we're already getting some comment in the chat. That works also. David, maybe you could make your points verbally to the group. David Constant?
Sure. Just I meant 3 small points in connection with aiskine. I find it very interesting that Aristotle says you feel aiskine for things you've done, are doing, or will do. So I tend to think of not the same contrast between aidos and aiskine, but aiskine can cover all 3, like English shame. The other point I was making is that Marta Jimenez has been arguing very forcefully for the importance of shame in training young people to virtue in Aristotle. Of course, that's a separate thing. And then finally, just as a parallel, in the Memorabilia, Socrates reduces poor young Euthydemus to helplessness, and he does it publicly, but then he takes him aside when he really wants to give him. And I think that corresponds very well to your distinction you draw between public humiliation and then the more constructive type of use of shame in a limited circle where you manage the negative consequences.
Thank you very, very much, David, for those 3, not necessarily small points, but very, very helpful ones. You're absolutely right about Aristotle. I have the feeling about Aristotle and the rhetoric. I have the feeling that his application of aiskune to future acts is a kind of Systemzwang, that it isn't covered that much by other attestations of aiskune in Greek, but it still is worth pointing out. And one can imagine future acts that I know that I'm going to commit, and I already feel aiskune for them. And as far as shame necessary in treating the young, absolutely. And I would just say, not just Aristotle, lots of people, and even nowadays, and perhaps especially nowadays, the whole question of shaming is one that has not gone away. We don't live in a guilt culture alone. Finally, your reference to memorabilia 4.2 is right on the money. And I was focusing in my article for the Festschrift, because we had a limited space, on the Gorgias. But if I do expand it, then I will certainly have to bring in not only other dialogues of Plato, but also Xenophon. And this is a wonderful example of the difference between shaming. And it's not so much public and private, but shaming before a large group and shaming before a small group of intimates. And I will certainly make use of that, with thanks to you. It's lovely to see you, David.
Lovely to see you.
Brad?
Yes, thank you very much, Glenn. This was wonderful and a very apt and telling reading of the Gorgias. But like David, I just like to say how much this resonates with later figures in the Socratic tradition, and especially in my mind these days, Epictetus makes enormous use, not just of eidos, but of elenkos and aiskune in his moral. Well, I don't like the word diatribes anymore, but in the moral speeches that he gives. In fact, one of the key techniques he uses is when he has an imagined interlocutor, is humiliation. And so I think this is something which comes down to Epictetus directly from Plato. We know he was a very keen reader of Plato, but also through the Cynic tradition. And there are, again, Cynics, claiming a kind of Socratic heritage. And they, according to the anecdotes we have, routinely use, very public humiliation as to generate a turnaround point in terms of moral motivation. So I think you've emphasized not just something critically important about the Platonic Socrates, but something which infects the entire tradition descending from it. So again, as with David, just elaborating some of the value that we take from this paper.
Brad, thank you, and it's lovely to see you too. From both of you, I get the feeling that I could do more and bring in more. And that's reassuring and troubling, because I have lots of other things to do, but I would not mind working this out in more detail. When I look at Epictetus, or even at Stoicism in this regard, I certainly see the affinities and analogies that you're pointing to. What I wonder is to what extent these are influences, direct influences from the figure of Socrates, which was of such importance in Greek culture and Greek philosophical history of philosophy, and to what extent it's not direct influence, but simply they are different moments in a continuous tradition in which philosophy is a social practice, and makes attempts to reach its philosophical goals by appealing to means that we too apply, but not as consciously, deliberately, and guiltlessly as the Greeks did. So Epictetus is a wonderful example, and I will certainly bring that in too. But the question is whether this, and it's obviously not restricted to the Platonic tradition, but it goes out from there more widely. I don't want to write a whole book on this subject, although it might be fun to do so. Let me think about it. Anyway, thank you very, very much for reminding me of Epictetus in this context.
Andre,
Okay, means thank you, Professor. Hello, Professor Most. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I really liked your point about who is being helped in the dialogue. Is it only the future readers of Plato's books, or is it also the intellectors that seem to be extremely angry at the refutation that they are suffering? I would like to believe that Polus, Callicles, and Gorgias are also being helped. I would like to know your position on the possibility that Socrates is also exemplifying by his elenchus, his way of talking, the true rhetoric that he mentions by the end of the book. I find this a very curious, interesting, and provocative thesis, believing that Socrates is actually showing how to do the thing he's proposing by 500 and something, I don't remember, when he's saying that there is a good kind of rhetoric that teaches people to be better or to improve people, to give them justice and temperance. And there is a bad kind of rhetoric that it's the one represented by Gorgias and Polus and the traditional rhetorics of their time. Black defended this some decades ago. And I would like to know your position about this, because I find hard to believe that they are being improved during the dialogue. I mean, I can see Gorgias being improved because, as Nichols Jr. proposed, he seems to be also a moderator of the dialogue. Not only Shane, but Gorgias keeps coming back and saying, no, please, Socrates, continue to speak. Or when Polus seems uninterested in the definition of rhetoric, he says, I can understand you, Socrates, please help me out, something like that. In the end, when Colloquium wants the conversation to end, Gorgias comes back again and, no, don't let this discussion without a head or something like that. He seems to be improved in some way. He seems to be interested in his own craft for some reason. And I like to believe that the true rhetoric worked on him. But in the case of Polus and Callicles, it's a lot harder to see this possibility. Polus actually disappears after being refuted. He doesn't come back in any moment. That's kind of disturbing. I don't know if disturbing is the right word, but you get my meaning. And Callicles seems extremely bothered by the whole discussion and seems to even lose interest by the end of the dialogue. So do you think this is a defensible, convincing thesis that the true rhetoric is being personified or being exemplified by Socrates? Or do you think is something like a model for a good rhetoric that maybe can't be reached in practical terms? Thank you very much.
Andre, thank you very much for your thoughtful question. We may end up having a difference in our reading of the Gorgias. There you are. You shifted on my screen, because I do think that while it is quite certain, I believe, that Callicles and Polus are not convinced and are not educated by Socrates, I believe also that the interchange with Gorgias also does not come to a satisfactory conclusion, and that Gorgias at a certain point just sort of can't get out of his vanity and self-complacency in order to really learn something. Let me make 3 points about this, which go beyond the dialogue, but which may explain my view on this matter. The first is that Plato, unlike, for example, Aristotle, thinks that very, very few people are capable of philosophy. He thinks that only a tiny minority of people are capable of really being philosophers or of understanding the truth. And so he doesn't have our democratic sense that nobody gets left behind. I think that for Plato, lots of people get left behind, and that's just the way it is. The second point is I think that Plato was fascinated by Socrates's failure to teach certain people how to live well. And the crucial case in this is Alcibiades. Alcibiades was Socratic and turned out badly. And so what do you do? Well, you can say that Alcibiades had the wrong nature, or you can say that Alcibiades really didn't have much to do with Socrates, or you can say that Alcibiades was in love with Socrates' body rather than with his mind. But whatever, there's an attempt in the Socratics to dissociate Socrates from Alcibiades as far as possible, and not to burden Socrates with the responsibility for Alcibiades' failings. Third answer, I think that Plato, as a writer, learned an enormous amount from Greek tragedy, also from Greek comedy, but especially from Greek tragedy. And there are numerous plays and numerous anecdotes about plays in which the hero ends badly, but it's not only about him, it's also about the lesson that one draws from the hero, both the lesson that the chorus draws in the play and sometimes other characters, and also the spectators. And I think that this is a technique that that Plato applies in his own dialogues. So in short answer to your question, I think that he uses the failure of Callicles, Polus, and Gorgias, not in order to show that Socrates is wrong, but to stimulate us to think better. When I say us, I mean his readers, his students in the academy, people who will read his stuff outside and will be turned to philosophy protreptically, but also all the people on my screen. Okay? Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
All right. Noboru Notomi.
Hello, Glenn. How are you? Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Well, I have a question about the Gorgias, because your explanation is nicely fit to many other dialogues as well. But particularly, why the Gorgias? Well, the explanation by Scuola I just wondered whether that formal aspect of the dialogue is connected with the content of the dialogue, because the dialogue between Polus and Socrates, the focus is three key terms, dikaiosune and agathon and kalon and aisklon. And finally, they are, well, Polus and Callicles are not just inconsistent in logic, but they misplaced, according to Socrates, they misplaced the aisklon and kalon. So I mean the between dikaion and agathon, the place of aisklon, ugliness, but also the shamefulness. And I think that's your talk urged me to think about, maybe there's some connection between the argument itself. I mean, how to consider aisklon and kalon in terms of or in relation to dikaiosune or agathon and aisklon thing. Well, I don't have any answer, but do you have any suggestion, ideas about that?
Noboru, thank you for your question, which is a wonderful question that I hadn't thought of, and I'll try to answer. But I want to say also, it's wonderful to see you again. And I remember fondly the last time that we saw one another. I hadn't really posed to myself this question. I had simply taken it for granted that the Gorgias is about shame, but I hadn't asked why in particular the Gorgias is about shame. And that's your question. It's a very good question. What I had noted was that shame is not only one of the things that people talk about, but that it also operates at it's not only a technique in the argument, but it's also subject matter of the argument. And I don't want to say that it plays a more central role to the Gorgias than it does to other dialogues. I'd have to go through the corpus first to be able to say that. But I can think of one reason why it might well be a particularly appropriate topic for the Gorgias. And that's my attempt to answer your question. Namely, that the Gorgias is about rhetoric. And rhetoric is about, among other things, doing what is good and not doing what is shameful. So much of what the orators do is to discuss and attribute and deflect shame from one another. That seems to me not surprising, that in a dialogue with rhetoricians, shame should become such a central concept. And if you think that when Aristotle,
yes, yes, of course, the Gorgias is a specialist in manipulating emotions, of course, including. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right, Dan Graham.
Hi, thank you very much, Glenn. Very interesting. Let me ask you, one word you didn't use in your presentation, the word conscience, that might be word conscience.
Conscience. Mhm.
Dan, I think you've gotten accidentally muted.
Okay.
Muted again. Yeah, word conscience. And so, but in any case, a thought here, you know, as in the great speech in the Protagoras, where you have the Protagoras saying that Zeus is going to send Hermes and tell him everybody needs a portion of eidos and decay. And it seems like a good translation there is something like conscience, sense of justice, a kind of inner notion there. So that seems to go there. And I think, at least in modern English, we tend to, shame tends to sound like something very external when we, you know, we're really trying to embarrass somebody and so forth. Whereas when we talk about things about conscience and so forth, there's a, well, at least a personal, subjective dimension to that. And it does seem like that Socrates never tries to tell you what's right and wrong. He tries to let you, you know, he's not teaching you the principles of right and wrong. He's teaching you to pay attention to what you already know about this sort of thing and so forth. So I just thought I'd ask you what you think about, you know, that kind of dimension of shame.
Thank you, Dan. Dan, it's wonderful to see you too. Again, you're absolutely right, although I hadn't noticed it, that I didn't use the word conscience in this talk. And reflecting now on why I didn't use it, I think that it's not accidental that I didn't use it. Because for me, conscience inevitably in modern American usage has a kind of either Christian, Judeo-Christian, or Kantian philosophical tinge to it in a way that goes, I think, in a different direction from most of the Greek discussion that I'm familiar with. When Protagoras talks about eidos and decay, I would not translate eidos as conscience, but as reverence. Eidos there is what prevents you from violating religious and moral values of the very highest level. Conscience is too inner, too subjective, too Kantian a term for me to be the first one that I would reach to in that situation. This may well have to do with my own usage of the English language, and I wouldn't at all suggest that everybody needs to adopt it. But I find difficulties in finding good cases of conscience in our sense in this period in ancient Greek. I find remorse, I find shame, I find reverence, but I don't find conscience.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks to you, but I will keep looking.
Okay, Thomas Schmidt. You're muted.
No.
There we go.
There we go.
I would also like to thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. I'm struck by what seems to me to be a reasonable contrast between the interlocutors in this dialogue being ashamed, as it were, of being found out. That their shame is that they were embarrassed.
Mm-hmm.
And that other remarkable figure shame, Alcibiades, who is ashamed of himself, ashamed of the self the life that he was living. So it's a much more profound kind of shame that he experiences. It's something closer to a genuine moral shame, whereas this is more of a social shame. Now, admittedly, in the Gorgias, you have an attack upon the profession of these men, on the profession of rhetoric, and I suspect that, or one may read in at any rate, that Paulus's very intemperate response is not only because of Socrates embarrassing his teacher, but because Socrates, as it were, exposes his profession as a fraud, and that's quite in its own way an attack on who he is and what he is living for. But back to the other contrast, which seems to me in some way more basic. In the Gorgias, you have this theme of rhetoric, this combatant verbal skill, and shame. But in the Symposium, you have a human being whose whole life is brought up and held in a mirror and shown to fall short. And he fully acknowledges it. And I wonder if one of the things that's missing in the Gorgias is the theme of eros. But that is not something we would say is missing from Alcibiades. And I wonder if there's a connection there between the capacity to experience the kind of existential shame that we find remarkably in the figure of Alcibiades, and his openness to eros.
Thank you, Thomas. Those are really interesting reflections. You're right that eros is missing in the Gorgias, and what is replaced by is aggressive emotions of all sorts. Many people have found the Gorgias to be one of the most pessimistic and bitter dialogues of Plato, and it could have done with a little bit of eros, perhaps, to make it more charming, but I guess that day Plato just wasn't in the mood. But more seriously, to the 2 points that you're making, first with regard to Alcibiades, and then with regard to shame for incoherence. You're absolutely right that Alcibiades in the Symposium feels shame not for this or that, but for his life as he's lived it. And it is a kind of profound expression of a kind of conversion experience, which is familiar from Greek philosophy and religion. The point is, however, that Alcibiades didn't do it. Alcibiades then, he has this moment, he acknowledges it, but he doesn't acknowledge it fully if you just look at how he lived. So, so he must have, the reader of the Symposium must think that Alcibiades had this moment and then forgot it. He was drunk after all, and he went on and lived a life which was not the one that he seemed to be pointed towards in the Symposium. What's extraordinarily interesting is that Plato shows him so much directed towards the good life there, but we know he didn't. That's one point. The other thing is about feeling shame for being incoherent. You are certainly right that that seems less fundamental, let's say less ontological, than the kind of shame that Alcibiades expresses in the Symposium. But on the other hand, it is still not only a question of maintaining an argument and feeling shame for having one position at one point and another position at another point. I think that behind that, let's say, logical shame is the shame of not being not having an identifiable identity as a male citizen who can be relied upon, somebody who does something one time and is consistent with everything else. That in the tight and anxious polis of Athens, it was important to be thought of as being a person who was who he was. And that is a kind of political identity for which this logical identity is a philosophical derivative. There are, of course, characters in the 5th century and 4th century and elsewhere who shift their positions notoriously. I'm teaching a seminar on Aristophanes' frogs now, and there are a number of swipes against people who shift from one side of the boat to the other side of the boat. But those are seen as exceptions, and there's something profoundly disreputable about them.
It strikes me that the way in which the Athenian citizen looked at consistency had more to do perhaps with a consistency of their speech and their action. Whereas Socrates in the Gorgias holds himself up somewhat uniquely as someone whose coherence is centered in this question of his speech being coherent, his speech being consistent. So I'm not sure how that would feed into this, but that's one of the remarkable moments in the Gorgias, a moment of Socratic self identification or description, and in that particular way. And in that way, he contrasts, it strikes me, very radically to the other 3 characters.
That's a really interesting point, and I will think about it. My immediate reaction is that, of course, in the Gorgias, the emphasis is upon Socrates' speech being parallel with his speech, and not his actions being parallel with his speech. But in the Socratic tradition, think of Xenophon, an enormous amount of attention is given to his actions as being parallel to his speech. And this then forms part of the notion of the philosophy as a way of life. And Socrates is in particular praised for not having done things that would have contradicted his views. So it does begin early, and it continues in the Socratic Platonic tradition. But you're right that in the Gorgias itself, there's much less emphasis on his actions.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Let's move on, Mariana.
Hello, Professor Most. Thank you very much for your very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I remembered, because I've been rereading Xenophon recently, some instances of Socrates shaming his interlocutors in the Memorabilia, and mostly in the Memorabilia. And I remembered what you said, and I agree with that Socrates in Plato tries sometimes to soften his elenchos and his method of shaming people for obvious reasons, but not so in Xenophon. I remember 2 very brutal attempts to shame somebody by Socrates, as reported by Xenophon. One refers to Critias and his passion for Euthydemus, which Socrates describes as swinish, hykon, in the presence of many other people, and Critias and Euthydemus himself. And the other is less direct, but also pointed at a concrete person, I don't know how you say it in English, and the sophist and the rhetor, Andokides. Okay. He's compared by Socrates in the Memorabilia to a male prostitute, implicitly or indirectly, but actually that's what he means. So because I'm mostly interested in the historic Socrates, as a historian, do you think it's possible to draw any conclusions on this on this difference between Xenophon and Plato? Is one more true to the historic Socrates or not? Or is it Plato or is it Xenophon? What do you think?
Thank you for your question. And it's a really interesting question. I'm going to speculate.
Okay.
And therefore, I may decide that this, the registration of this will be destroyed. We will see, but I will tell you what I think. I think that Socrates got a lot of people in Athens really angry with him. And I think that if he hadn't, it's hard to imagine how he could have been condemned. Certainly, at least to judge from what information we have, reliable or unreliable, about his apology, his defense speech, defense speech could not have antagonized more people if it had been calculated to do so. But I don't believe that it was simply the defense speech that made people decide for him to be poisoned, but that for years he had been angering people. So it seems to me not unlikely that the kind of direct humiliating shaming that Xenophon describes would be more characteristic of at least the way some people saw Socrates than the much more tactful, gentle, refined picture that we get in the Gorgias. If so, then the question is, why did Plato soften Socrates in the Gorgias? And if that's the case, one way to go is to look at all of Plato's dialogues and to see that there's a general tendency to soften Socrates there as compared with Xenophon. But another way to go is to look at the Gorgias itself and to see that Socrates is talking there, among others, with people who are really angry and nasty. And for him to start off being angry and nasty would have not only made a discussion difficult, but would also have justified them. Whereas by starting off as nice and soft, but nonetheless arriving at a kind of failure, Socrates shows, well, it's not my fault that it doesn't work. It's not the problem of the Elencos, it's the problem of these terrible people. I was as nice as one could possibly be, and it still didn't work. So I think that it might therefore be part of the conception of the Gorgias itself. But I want to look now again at the memorabilia from this point of view. And if your impression is right, then I would say that in this regard, as probably in some other regards, Xenophon's portrayal of Socrates may or may not be truer than Plato's, but it probably corresponds to what more people thought about Socrates.
We can ask Don.
Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariana.
Lawrence Bloom.
Hi, thank you, Professor Most. I really enjoyed that talk quite a lot, and I'm largely in agreement and sympathetic to your view of the positive role of shame for moral development, which most people here seem to be in agreement with. So much so, in fact, that I'm wondering, I'm hoping that you're bothered by the same passage as I am in the Gorgias, and I'm hoping to get some help from you on it. And that's a short statement made by Socrates at the beginning of his interaction with Callicles, where
You have
for some reason, I'm sorry?
You have the numbers.
Yeah, I do actually. It's around 487, 487a, where he actually praises Callicles for not being ashamed. And he goes so far as to criticize Polus and Gorgias for their shamefulness, which led them into public contradiction. I'm wondering if you have any sense of why he would do that. it seems completely opposite. He should be encouraging Callicles. It seems he should be encouraging Callicles to be more ashamed, in fact.
That's a really good question. I didn't talk about this passage in the article, but I will have to do so if I ever do anything with this article. There's different ways to try to answer that question. One way would be that Socrates knows that Callicles is not going to be convinced by him, and that he can't appeal to his sense of shame, so that he's sort of pushing him, inciting him to go further, knowing that he will fail and that this will become notable, remarkable. Another possibility is that he is distinguishing. So another possibility is that he's distinguishing between Callicles on the one hand and Polus and Gorgias on the others, on the other hand, and saying that Callicles's shamelessness is constructive for, in his case, whereas the shamefulness was not constructive in the case of Polus and Gorgias. A third possibility would be to say that Socrates is just flattering him and pretending to play his game, but that it's ironic and that we shouldn't think that this is what Socrates really believes. What do you think?
I'm not sure. In some ways, I agree with all of those, but I can't help thinking that there's something more going on there that I'm missing, honestly. But I agree with you, and especially the part about it's almost a Socratic rope-a-dope. Just make this guy even more shameless, and then we'll really be able to.
Exactly. Yeah. Here's some rope. Why don't you take some more rope? And there's a tree over there too. Yeah. So yeah. I think that's how it is. And but you're right to point me and us to that passage, which I didn't mention. And I will certainly try to diffuse it when I come to redo the article.
Well, thank you for the paper. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Lawrence.
William,
isn't that tied into the later comment about how wonderful it is he's found someone who will argue with him to all the way down?
Mm-hmm. And the difference from this point of view might indeed be with Polus and Gorgias. This was my second thought, that Polus just stops. He withdraws from the argumentation at a certain point into angry silence. Gorgias keeps on going, but his waffling and verbiage doesn't really help very much. So Callicles might indeed be a better alternative.
Thank you.
Okay, Brad again. Brad?
No, I'm sorry, I hadn't had a chance to ask yet.
There's several ahead of me in the queue. William and I think Amy as well.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amy. You need to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, Glenn.
Thank you so MSC. Wonderful to see you.
It's nice to see you. Thank you so much. To my taste, you spoke very little about Gorgias himself. So you said that in the end, he fails to recognize the authority of reason, but I don't remember if you attributed shame to him. Do you agree with Paulus's sort of psychoanalysis that he also felt shame? What do you make out of the silence of Gorgias at the end of their dialogue with Socrates? Because he doesn't speak. Okay, Polus interrupts, but I guess he interrupts because Gorgias doesn't say anything. Yeah. He just stands there. So what do you think, make out of his silence? And do you think he feels shame? And a connected question would be, if it's some logical incoherence that he is refuted by some way, as Paulus says, then what is the connection, if he feels shame at all, what is the connection between logical incoherence and shame?
Thank you, MSC. And as I said, it's wonderful to see you again. I remember very well the last time we met. I didn't talk about Gorgias as much as about Callicles and Polus, in part because that would have lengthened the paper beyond the limits that were established in the Festschrift, in part because it's a much more complicated situation. With Polus, it's very easy, and with Callicles, it's not so difficult. With Gorgias, it's more problematic, in part because of the difference of age and prestige, let's say, between Socrates and Gorgias. So Socrates has to handle him with much more delicate forceps than the younger people. In fact, the whole age aspect of this dialogue, as of so many Platonic dialogues, is I think quite crucial. But I do think that ultimately Polus's analysis is right. That is to say, Gorgias was driven to a point of feeling shame about an incoherence in himself, and therefore simply withdrew from the conversation, not sort of slamming the door on it in the way that Polus did, but ultimately not differently. So I will add a paragraph about Gorgias if and when I revise the article, and I will thank you for stimulating me to do so.
Thanks.
Thank you, MSA.
Okay, so a final question from Brad Inwood.
No, I think if I may say so.
I'm sorry, William is ahead of me. I'm sorry.
I'm missing something.
Yeah,
William Lyons has been
back in.
Forgive me, but William Lyons is also on my screen, has been trying to get in.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see properly.
Yeah, I would be sorry if Brad can't have another question.
Well, we'll just be concise and we'll get through.
Good. This should be a short question. Glenn, thank you for your paper. You mentioned in response to an earlier question, why is the dialogue about shame? And I was listening to hear if you said this, and I may have missed it, but could it be that Plato is redefining shame, rather along the lines in which Socrates redefined arete? That I'm thinking of the end of the dialogue in particular, where Socrates says to Callicles, we should give up the pursuit of honor, which is sort of the flip side of shame, and instead not worry about suffering humiliations like being slapped, but should in all cases be willing to suffer injustice rather than commit it, that it's more shameful, in effect, to commit injustice than to shame it, so that the reader is left with the lesson that the socially defined standard of shame is mistaken.
William, that's a really interesting question. I had simply supposed that Plato in the Gorgias was directing our attention to shame as a subject and as a mechanism in philosophical dialogue, but I hadn't considered the possibility that he is trying to redefine shame in so doing. My sense is that he is probably, that if he is redefining shame, he's not doing it in a systematic and thematic way, but that he's sort of implying it along the way. And that therefore it's not, let's say, the primary burden of the dialogue to offer a systematic redefinition and reconception of shame, but in the course of thinking about shame in different ways, certain aspects of it become evident that would in fact lead to a redefinition, but not in the dialogue itself. Okay? So I thank you for that. That sheds new light on the dialogue for me. Thank you.
All right, we do have time, I think. Brad, if you would like to briefly ask the final question.
Sure, just two quick observations, one and suggestions. So one, Glenn, some of this conversation has made me think about the importance of parrhesia, frankness of speech. And I think it would be interesting to sort of set your approach alongside Foucault's engagement with this. I think sparks will strike, and I think that would be interesting. And my last thought is about the very beginning of your paper, and there's something I think philosophically very important that you did, and then you passed on to the substance of your paper, in talking about the way rationality as a norm requires the social reinforcement of shame. You're taking a position on a very important philosophical point, that rationality itself isn't a freestanding autonomous value, but rather is fully socially embedded. And I think that's many philosophers would bristle at that. Many would agree. I think it would be a shame as you develop this if you didn't foreground that, because I think it's one of the more striking philosophical claims you make, and it's worth reflecting on.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you so much for both of these suggestions. I have read and bristled at Foucault on parousia for years, and have never had a real Auseinandersetzung, a real critical discussion with it, and this might be the occasion for doing that. And the other thing is something which I very profoundly believe, and which I indicate in some footnotes in the published version, but which cannot really just be put out there as though it were self-evident. And that is that not only is rationality socially determined, but also philosophical argumentation is a form of social discourse, just like other forms of social discourse. It has its community, it has its standards, it has its claims for greater validity, as all such ones do. And I'm not trying to destroy philosophy, although I'm sure there are philosophers who would think that I am, but simply to see it as embedded in a whole web of social practices, which I think, which at least to me, makes sense. But I see philology in the same way as a social practice. And I see what we're doing in this discussion now as a form of philosophical discussion, which is a social phenomenon, even if we're all on a screen. So I'm delighted by your suggestions. And I'm afraid that all of this means that I'm probably going to have to expand and elaborate on my little paper and do something larger with it. So thank you very, very much. And thanks to you all.
And thank you, Glenn, for this wonderful presentation. And thanks to everyone for joining us here today. So goodbye.
Thank you.